Welcome to the brief and our series, Out of the Pod. For today's episode, we wanted to look at that one aspect that is common across industries and sectors, and which is probably the first when it comes to biting the bullet because of the pandemic's impact on business human capital. So, for this, we spoke to Gaurav Chattur, Managing Director, APAC region at Catenon, a Spanish company in India, as he takes us through the journey of his firm and then goes on to detail the various aspects of human capital that, particularly in the case of white collar jobs, will be impacted and influenced because of the COVID 19 situation. Hi, Gaurav. Thank you so much for taking out the time and joining us today. How are you?
Hi, Sean. I'm doing well, well as we can do in these times, and very happy to be in good health. Really.
That's a very good thing to hear. And I'm guessing the impact of the entire scenario with the pandemic is, I mean, it's personal and professional, and the whole work from home scenario. How is it, working for you guys there?
So luckily, culturally, we were always aligned to a work from home situation, and the core reason being trust was inherently, present in our work culture. So whenever an employee wanted to work in usual scenarios as well from home, whether it be a person who wants to take care of his children or somebody who wants to attend to a ailing relative, we always had this flexibility. So adapting to the work from home has not been a great challenge. However, doing a sustained work from home is rather mundane, right?
Yep, I agree. But since we're talking about Catanon's work, let's kind of have a quick look into that. Y'all have been in India for a decade now, if I'm right.
Yes, it's been 10 years.
And you're presently, I think you're heading the entire APAC region. So India has always kind of been looked at next in line to China in terms of being a manpower resource market. In this context, and because it's also Southeast Asia that you look at, how do we fare in that sense?
So we are an incredible market as far as human resources go. I mean, it does not require me to talk about the management talent that we've been exporting globally. But if I look at the region as a whole, and if you look at the senior folks in the region, whether it be Southeast Asia, Asia in general, or even globally, a lot of talent from India has risen to N minus one roles. And I think a lot of onus goes to the STEM education in India, as well as the high quality of management talent that we are able to export. Essentially, it comes down to one simple fact, and it's going to be very important in post-coronavirus world, is that Indians know how to do more with less.
And that's actually a very interesting point. Now, tell me that having been a Spanish company that's come to India, were there changes that in your overall process and how you all kind of functioned as a business? Were there changes that you all kind of had to instrument to cater to working in India?
So, for the largest part of our 10 years, we worked as a wholly owned subsidiary of the Spanish company, following procedures and ways to go to market, just like we did anywhere else in the world. We realized through this journey that India obviously requires a different treatment. The rate of change in India, the kind of market sensitivities, and what works in India, what is acceptable, is quite different from what is acceptable in Europe in general. And with that in view, we did a management buyout last year where myself, along with a group of investors, now has a majority stake in the India and Singapore businesses, with a primary view that we can push for growth in this market with solutions and offerings which are tailored to this market and which don't necessarily have to mimic what we have in Europe.
That's actually a very interesting approach to addressing the local market here. And also, I'm guessing that a lot of your work probably comes in from outside.
Well, not really. So we have three types of clients, largely, right? We have global MNCs, which are already present in India, which we've engaged with within India and garner the business. Then there is, of course, some part of business that comes from Europe. But that's a small part, and there is majority of our business is with Indian MNCs, which means Indian companies that are not only looking to hire people in India but hire people across the world. So we've catered to 50 plus countries from India. US has been the predominant market of interest for Indian companies. The homogeneity of US also attracts, and the size, of course, has always been a large market to chase. But beyond that, we've catered to Europe very actively, Middle East, Africa, and Asia Pacific.
So, given the current pandemic scenario, if the majority of your business comes from India, and given how European markets and the American market right now is doing, this is hopefully a good thing for you all.
Absolutely. I think one must look at short term, mid term, and long term. I think in the short term, basically, we all would grapple to understand what's going on, and that's perfectly understandable. That's natural. In the midterm, I think there is going to be a revival of demand because core industries in India would still see a good demand and a good need for their services, for both goods and services going. But in the longer term, which is anywhere between 12 months to 36 or 20, 48 months, I would say that all companies around the world would want to do two things. One, reduce the costs in their home countries. All functions that can be outsourced would be outsourced. But two, also look at moving away from China or China dependent countries to have their manufacturing supply chains based out of some other country. And if you look at which other countries could play a part here, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, India would probably be the standout countries. The remaining three countries still remain primarily China dependent or highly invested by China. So India would stand out as a country which is independent of China in many ways and can serve as an alternative.
Since we're actually looking at this, the impact per se, right, of the pandemic on current markets, given the line that you all are in, especially because you all work so extensively with white collar jobs, how much has it affected your industry?
Yeah, so no secret there. I think one of the first things to go on freeze is hiring when something like this happens. It's been a shock. We've had no less than 3 dozen searches go on hold within a span of like 10 days since the impact of the pandemic was obvious in India. And I think it's a discretionary spend. It becomes a discretionary spend in these times from being an absolute necessity. As a natural reaction, everyone, including myself, would suspend all future hiring till we know whether we are standing on firm ground or not. Given that most of our businesses is come to a halt, however, there has been some silver lining. We've still managed to sell in this market. We still managed to get some positions where the plans are concrete and typically unaffected by this pandemic.
This is actually a very good thing to hear. But tell me also, given how working patterns are kind of changing now, people are getting more acclimatized working from home. The concept of remote working, which earlier a lot of industries refrained from, didn't see the need of it, or just thought of it as either tedious or something that couldn't deliver as much efficiency. Out of necessity, that was born today. And I think people have pretty much adapted really well to it. Is this playing a role now? I mean, or in the near future, do you see this making an effect on how companies look for candidates? Then it starts becoming agnostic to geography, also, right?
Absolutely. So man is a creature of habit, and I think if you it's said that if you do something for 21 days regularly, you become habitual to it. But jokes apart, I think for far too long we've been giving the excuses that it requires me to see a person face to face to be able to get meaning out of the discussion. But those excuses have gone out of the window because suddenly something else has taken precedence. And I think sooner or later, so let's see how this pans out. But what I suspect is a few things will happen. One, the lockdowns around the world and including India would extend. Two, people would be very wary of meeting other people in person. The fear of infection would still linger. Three, there could be a second wave of the pandemic. So that's going to also mean that lockdowns may reappear. And I don't want to sound grim here. I'm just sort of quoting what I read.
Hmm. There's a fair possibility.
Yeah, and for people are going to realize that there are safer, easier, and cheaper ways of doing meetings, and these are far more efficient for everybody's times. So instead of plying through heavy traffics in Bangalore or Mumbai or Delhi, if they were able to do it over a Zoom call, they would really zoom their businesses. So I think there is a reason to believe that this is here to stay, and work from home would also mean that the very steep real estate cost, which could be anywhere between 15 to 25,000 per head in a tier one metro in India, would be avoided. And how nice it would be for you and me to meet our teams once a week at in a nice place outside of work, where we collaborate, have a good time, a nice meal together, and then work 4 days a week from home. So I think we want to see a drastic change in how people work, collaborate, and are still able to get meaningful results.
And there's also this aspect that it can significantly control human capital, the expense towards human capital, right? Companies incur. Also, the optimization when it comes to the available resources. One, they will learn to deploy them better. And the other is that they will probably not need a full 100%. It could start becoming what we refer to as a gig economy. It can probably lead to a bigger evolution of that.
Absolutely, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think once people realize that people can work remotely, people will staff as required only. People will reduce the size of the bench that they have in their companies, so as to say. They will rely on freelancers increasingly because trust is going to be fundamental to people working from home any which ways. And they in effect what they would do is bring down their fixed costs, and even if they have to incur higher costs when required, they would be more willing to do so. So I think the whole lens of viewing workforce would change.
I have a question, and this is something that I've always maintained when people, companies give out a whole work from home. A lot of companies, even pre-pandemic, had very flexible work from home routines. Like you mentioned, I believe your company also had it. I know my firm also did have it. So there is a question that I always had: is an aspect of integrity. How do you address this? How do you address integrity as a question?
And that's a very good question. I think there is no straight answer to this, but what I can tell you is for sure. Culturally, what I've noticed is when you put a lock to something, there is a higher probability of a theft happening. So, which means when you try and put too many boundaries to a data or to information, you invest in the wrong type of security. What you need to really invest in is selecting the right people, not putting boundaries around what people can do. Once you have the right people and you have the trust, integrity becomes a non-issue. A lot of organizations have in the past and in the future will continue to make the wrong decisions with people, and and that's where integrity issues will happen. But integrity can also manifest, or lack of integrity can manifest in many other forms, right? uh, in the previous world, in the world where we people still turned up at offices, there are a lot of people who used to be physically present in office but would be doing something else altogether. I know of folks who would spend days doing day trading at their desks uh, when they were supposed to be churning out deliverables for the company. So, and I think that's an integrity issue as well. So, what you classify as integrity and how do you measure a person's integrity is going to be very, very key recruitment questions that companies would face in a work from home scenario. But once done right, companies will have to not bother about monitoring this aspect, and that's great because what is worst use of human time is to manage or look over the shoulder of another human being and see if he or she is doing what is required to be done.
That's actually very interesting because this change that we can see happening gradually. There is a lot of talk across industries that a fair bit of it is here to stay. And even with respect to the pandemic, there is literally not going to be a one fine day when everything is okay and people start going back to office. It's going to be done in installments. And like you said earlier in the conversation, people are still going to have a certain amount of wariness to it, which kind of brings us to this place where, the future looks interesting, so to say, right? And there are certain industries and sectors which probably are a little more inclined, or they're more susceptible to kind of adopting a work from home scenario, or at least a more flexible approach to it. Personally, because given the business you're in and you'll have worked with so many sectors and industries, personally, do you think there are any sectors, industries that kind of come to the fore in this sense?
So, in terms of which companies would be wary to adopt work from home,
Yes.
so any industry that deals with data which is of very high sensitivity, like a banking industry or a pharmaceutical industry, where deep research and where intellectual property of the data is of great importance, would be the ones. But even there, I would say certain functions could still work from home. Functions which can work from home should work from home. Opinion. Where you're dealing with live data and where you're dealing with very sensitive information, some protocols may still apply. But for most of the other industries where no single person can figure out the whole set of output by themselves, I think it's fair to say that a distributed workforce across geographies, why just within the same city, across various cities and various continents could work together to come up with a work product.
And how does it affect? So this is it's a question of demand supply, right? So even if companies, certain industries open up to the concept of work from homes and facilitate remote working as an option, let's say a certain upskilling or training is going to start being required. In this context, India as a market has always been known for, like we said earlier in our discussion, is that India has always been a human capital resource rich geography. Going forward into this post-pandemic world, how much is this going to change this perception?
Yeah, so digital readiness and digital savviness are going to be two very important skills that are going to come to the fore in the post-pandemic world. So what do I mean by this? Digital readiness means comfort with using digital tools. All sorts of digital tools, whether it be your Slack or your Zoom or sharing stuff over cloud and ensuring that CRMs are updated, would become extremely important. And digital savviness, which means whether now not just that you're digitally ready, but whether you have those tools and whether you can use the tools, whether how best can you use those tools to achieve your objectives. Whether your sales team can now, instead of doing face-to-face calls, engage with people on Twitter, LinkedIn, and other forms of social media, and make meaningful conversations remotely and close sales without seeing the person face-to-face. Whether an operations manager could ensure that his team delivers according to plan without necessarily having to huddle them up in a room and give them a pep talk. So a lot of things in terms of characteristics of managers would also change. I think digital communication by nature requires a lot more empathy. Having people in a room, you could exude a lot of confidence and intimidation to get things pushed. But digital is going to be a different competency set, and upskilling would definitely help. I think more and more we would go back to what was very important when the first wave of IT hit India, is understanding interpersonal relations and cross-cultural sensitivities. I think that's going to be even more important now that we are going to be digitally connected.
That's actually a very interesting point. So tell me one thing. I mean, because you're a Spanish, your roots kind of sit there, right, as a Spanish company. And given the entire current scenario, looking at especially the Spanish economy, has this affected your immediate operations?
Not really. Like I said, very small percentage of our business originated from Spain. It does bother me immensely that Spain is in such health crisis. And it's more personally because I've visited Spain so often and practically feel that it's second home for me. But as far as business goes, impact of Spain on India has not happened, is not that telling for us. However, impact of India on India itself is quite pronounced right now. So we don't require to pass on the blame on some other country here at all. I think each country individually is sufficiently affected.
And going into the future, do you see this? I mean, not just Spain specific, since we were talking Indo-Spanish, but generally, do you see this affecting how foreign companies deal and work with India? There's a short-term and a long-term aspect to it.
I think it's just going to accelerate the rate at which business is done with India for a number of reasons. If one can work remotely with people based out of Spain or elsewhere in the world, why not work with people based out of India? The obvious cost arbitrage is going to still remain. But beyond that, even finding people with the right skill sets is always a challenge in other countries where India obviously presents itself as a supplier of required skills. Therefore, I think there's going to be a huge rush in the post-pandemic world to set up different kind of entities, whether it be global in-house centers or large manufacturing units. And this could be for multiple reasons. One, cost saving, to reducing dependence on China, like I said before. And three, just sort of finding a lot of skill sets with the flexibility to so if you reduce your cost by 60% and relocate it to India, and that cost too becomes flexible, that means you do have easier labor laws as far as white collar workforce goes in India as compared to Europe. Then why would you hire in Europe and not hire in India?
Okay, so now before you go, I have two questions. One's actually more of a closing note in your remarks, but my question first. Times such as these, like pandemics, which eventually lead to global recessions, we've had different instances in the past. They lead to large scale unemployment. Yes, for a fact, there is a certain temporariness also to it because at some point the economy and industries relatively start picking up and hence the jobs are created. But personally, how long do you think it would take for the economy to start covering?
I think for it to come back to levels that were pre-pandemic, it would take anywhere between 12 to 18 months. And people are going to be affected. There is no doubt about it. I think companies should try to defer their firing decisions as far as possible. I know collective survival is more important than individual pain here, but people who are let go in this environment are going to find it quite tough to be gainfully employed for some time. I think what all of us can do during this time, whenever you see downtime, you should upgrade your skills. You should get future ready. You rightly pointed out, upskilling, and we talked about the digital world. I think that is a key for anybody who sort of finds himself out of job right now. Instead of being fatalistic, I think we could be futuristic and make ourselves future ready, because the future is going to be bright. I think, at least for this part of the world, I am fairly positive for India that we will see a lot of job creation. From after 18 months, we'll see a sudden surge in demand, simply because the demand would have shifted to India.
You know, you literally tread into my second question so beautifully and naturally that I don't even need to ask you the question. You have already answered it because that's exactly kind of what I wanted to kind of get your closing remarks on. How do people or employees essentially use this downtime preparing themselves for the future? And I think you already have answered that really well. So, on a side note, and this is a follow up to my previous one, do you think there's enough being offered or proposition from the government side in terms of safeguarding employment?
Not really. I think the government has issued some advisories, and that's about it, right? And in a way, I think the government also has been guilty of overreaching into areas where business needs to take a decision and not the government. So probably it's good that the government is not treading into spaces it should not. However, having said that, any sort of relief to the business that in turn enables us or enables the business to ensure that continued employment of its workforce happens would be useful. And this could come in terms of tax relief, or it could come in terms of deferred cash flows, or whatever, rental reliefs. It's really up to the government. I don't see government in India doing what governments in, say, Singapore or US can do, where they actually help individual businesses by helping them stay afloat. And I think in that sense, we are a resource constrained country. But we also, as a business community, can also take care of each other. Where larger companies, who's at risk? Smaller companies which are dependent on the cash flows as operating expenses are highly exposed. Right now, it's still not an accounting problem, it's still a cash flow problem. It's going to convert into an accounting problem a few months later, and there's no denying that. But in the interim, I think the larger companies owe it to the ecosystem to ensure that they pay their suppliers on time, and they ensure that if there is a piece of work they can still pass on outside their walls as a goodwill gesture, to ensure that these companies stay afloat, they must do so.
Yes, yes, I very much agree. And I think that's something that it's kind of just keep the economy moving. Even if it's slow, at least it'll keep it moving and it doesn't grind to a halt.
Absolutely.
Right. And it's a virtuous circle. Then I mean people retain jobs, spending continues, even if it's less curtailed, but at least it continues. So it's a good thing.
Absolutely. And think about those who work on daily wages, right?
Yes.
I mean, enough ink has been spent on it, but we have to all recognize that they have no fallback options. If I were to get out of employment, I would still have family, extended family to go to, who would probably not mind sort of taking care of me, so as to say. But this set comes from an ecosystem where everybody's in the same boat, and they probably don't even have a dwelling where they can keep provisions for more than a few days for multiple reasons, right? We have to keep that into consideration when we think about every decision that we make about spending. So I would say defer your exorbitant spendings for some other day, but think about giving business to someone, and ensuring that you pay them on time.
Yes, yes. So, Gaurav, this was an excellent conversation. Thank you so much for taking out the time today. And we really hope that, the optimism that you and I do share in the sense of how things will start as an uptick, this kind of materializes sooner than later. And hopefully we'll chat soon once the pandemic's seen through and things get better.
Pleasure is mine, Sean. It was lovely speaking to you. You stay safe, and let's hope for the best.